Hey everybody, this is Rabbit, welcome back to the channel, and that is the brand new skidding sound for when your plane is grinding along the ground in the new Dance of Dragons update for War Thunder. And in this video we're looking at some of the new vehicles and the new features in that update. Kicking us off with air battles, we have a brand new loadout screen UI, and this shows the ordnance on the plane as you're selecting it, and you can even expand and contract the menu so you can see it better, or if you don't want to see it at all. My big issue with this is that it actually kind of obscures the stats for the actual weapons unless you pull it all the way up, and if you're pulling it all the way up, why is it even here to begin with? This is nice visual flair, but at the end of the day it does kind of make it a little bit harder to see the actual stats of the weapons you're equipping to the plane, so I don't love it, but it's not awful. The game also added a feature for air battles that you can select where you can add, in addition to barometric altitude, radar altitude. Barometric is essentially your altitude or your distance from sea level, whereas radar altitude is your distance from the ground. The radar altitude is really only usable if you're at top tier and you're attempting to multipath, but it is pretty useful for that game mode. However, if you don't really play at top tier, you can mostly ignore it. It is just for radar guided missiles anyway, and if I'm being honest, I really wish they would just make the multipathing a little bit higher in altitude, but that's just me. You can access this by going to Air Battle Settings in the Options menu and scrolling down to Indicated Altitude. You can set it as barometric, radar, or both. I would personally recommend both, as I find both of them can be pretty useful in most cases. Additionally, kind of sort of related to air, they did start adding a lot more stuff to the damage models of helicopters, such as the Ka-52. They are going to be adding more later, but currently there's only a handful of helicopters that have a bunch of stuff in them, and obviously there is a lot more in these types of helicopters than just empty space, and Gaijin is finally starting to fill some of that out, so they should at least take more damage when you hit them. Speaking of damage models, while you're in the X-ray view, you can now go to a drop down and select specific components for it to only show you. So if you just want to see where ammunition is located in a tank, you can select specifically that and just see where the ammo stowage is. So this is a pretty nice feature to have, especially as they can get pretty cluttered, especially with all the extra stuff they've been adding to these vehicles lately. Air Battles also added satellite guided bombs, which honestly don't require that much of an explanation. You simply lock a point on the ground and throw the bomb and it will guide itself towards that point. They can't hit moving targets, so their applications in ground battles are a little limited. In air battles, mostly limited to hitting bases or static targets like pillboxes. In ground battles, the only real application I could see is throwing them into the enemy spawn, because a lot of anti-airs just tend to hang out there, but that's really about it. So while it's a nice weapon to have in the game, I don't think it's going to have too much of an impact. So now we're going to do a pretty quick and dirty look at each of the planes they added with this update and give you some of my thoughts. And the very first plane we're going to look at is a new Premium Harrier 2 added to the American Air Tree. The Premium Harrier 2 is very similar to the Tech Tree Harrier 2, except it doesn't have the AIM-120s or the AIM-9Ms, and this puts it at a much lower battle rating at only 11.3 in both ground and air, and this actually makes the vehicle pretty useful as its ground attack capability is fairly considerable for an 11.3. In air battles, it's probably not going to be that bad, but it probably won't be that great either. Overall, it's not the worst thing you can buy, but it's not the best. The best application for this is really for ground battle players that don't feel like grinding an air tree. If you just want a good ground attacker, this can fit the bill. Next up, we're going to look at the two new F-111 aardvarks, the American and the British one, because they are very similar. There are some minor differences in ordnance, but on the whole they are the same and they are at the same battle rating. They come with AIM-9Ls, which is a pretty good missile, but not amazing, especially for an 11.7 aircraft. Their overall flight performance is not great. It takes a while to accelerate up to speed, especially if they have ordnance, and they will lose their speed very quickly in a turn. In terms of ground attack though, they have pretty exceptional ordnance for their battle rating, at least for a plane that is supersonic and can fly at high altitudes. Normally this kind of ordnance for 11.7 is reserved for subsonic planes like Harriers, Su-25s, or A-10s, etc. So overall, I think they're a pretty good ground attacker, although I strongly question whether they're going to be all that good in air battles. Next up, we have one of the more questionable planes of the patch, the A-10C. I do not like where it's at battle rating wise, and I'm just going to say that right off the bat. 11.3 in air, given how slow this thing is pretty painful, especially because you only have AIM-9Ms, you don't have any kind of radar guided missile, and 12.0 in ground is also pretty rough, as it's basically at the same battle rating as the Harrier 2, but the Harrier 2 has AMRAAMs, so the Harrier 2 can fight other planes a lot more efficiently, and this doesn't have considerably better ordnance, it just has more of it, but that doesn't really help if you can't get near the battlefield. I hope I'm wrong on this, and I hope this is a good plane, but I just am not seeing it right now. I think this plane is kind of dead on arrival. Next up, we have a Swiss premium plane for the German Air Tree. This is the FFA P-16. This is a jet fighter. The performance seems reasonably good, although not anything too special, especially for 9.0, and the ordnance is just AIM-9Bs and unguided air bombs and rockets with no CCIP. It doesn't immediately strike me as that great, but I might be missing something about it. Overall, it's interesting because it's entirely user-made and it is a very unique plane, but it doesn't seem very functional, at least at its current battle rating. Next up, we have the Su-24M for the Soviet tech tree, and in air battles, this is probably going to be mildly useless. You have 4 R-60Ms, you also have a gimbal-mounted gun, which is cute, but the FOV on it seems pretty low. The vehicle is a bit of a bus. If you try to turn pretty hard, you're going to lose all of your speed basically instantly, although it does at least have good acceleration, but it is pretty massive and it is a pretty big target. In ground battles, it's a lot more capable. As a supersonic fighter that has some fairly good ordnance, including KH-29s, it can certainly do work, although it does lack a thermal imaging capability like a lot of Soviet planes around this battle rating, but on the whole, you could certainly do a lot worse at 11.3. Next up, we have the titular Dragons, the J-10A and the JF-17, and I'm going to talk about both these planes at the same time because they're both in the Chinese tech tree, and they're both pretty similar in terms of their capabilities, roles, and battle rating. In air battles, the J-10A is 13.7, the JF-17 is 13.3. Both of them have excellent acceleration and low speed performance characteristics. The J-10A in particular has fairly ridiculous stall handling, so they should be pretty capable in a one-on-one fight. However, the JF-17 does lose its speed very quickly in a turn fight. In terms of their missiles, both of them seem to have pretty capable missiles. I'm not seeing a huge difference right now, but I would have to do a lot more testing to really get a good idea. In ground battles, both of them are 12.3, and both of them have a fairly limited inventory of laser-guided bombs, so not really the strongest ground attackers, but they're okay. Next up for Italy, we have the Tornado IDS, which is basically the same as the German Tornado IDS. All you get is unguided bombs with a ballistic computer and some AIM-7Ls. It's very okay at air and ground battles, and that's about it. Not really anything to write home about. Next up for France, we actually get 2 new Dutch planes. We get the Sea Fury and the Sea Hawk. Both of these planes are essentially carbon copies of the British version. As far as I can tell, there's no difference and they're at the same battle rating. So if you're familiar with those aircraft, you should have a pretty good idea here, but both of them have a decent capacity for unguided bombs and are reasonably capable if underwhelming fighters. The Sea Hawk is a premium vehicle and I'm not entirely certain it's worth it. It's not bad, but it's not great, and the Sea Fury is kind of in the same area, so they're respectable choices, but they're not really anything to write home about in my opinion. And last up for planes, we have the Israeli F-16C Barak 2. This is very similar to the F-16D Barak 2 and the American F-16C. The big difference between this and the F-16D Barak 2 is that this doesn't have GBU-8s, but does have AIM-120 AMRAAMs, and it is lighter because you don't have that second person in it. It's certainly a good aircraft, and it's a reasonably capable multi-role fighter, even if it is limited to only laser-guided bombs in terms of precision ordnance, so definitely pick it up, and especially if you don't care about the GBU-8s, it is kind of just an upgrade over the F-16D. For ground battles this update, we did get a brand new and kind of interesting option, and that is the option to customize the sights on your vehicles. Just go to the options menu, ground battle settings, and you will have a prompt to change the various sights on the vehicles. You actually select it on a vehicle by vehicle basis, which is kind of cool. There's a bunch of pre-made sights, and you can even make presets that you can apply to certain vehicles. The only minor annoyance to this is that you do have to apply them individually. You can't just make one preset and then apply it to everything. So that is slightly annoying, but on the whole, I do really like this system, and it does give you a lot of options to customize the sights for the various vehicles. One of the reasons I really appreciate this is the old graduated sights were actually pretty rough on the high velocity Sabos, as the graduation bars would get pretty close together, whereas here you can use a more modern gun sight that doesn't use those graduations because you don't really need them, especially with a laser rangefinder, so that is a pretty nice quality of life feature. Before we get started on the new vehicles, there were 2 pretty noticeable changes in the last patch. The first one is with the HSTVL. The HSTVL now has a proximity fuse and an auto tracker, so it can be used as an ad hoc anti-aircraft, which is really nice. Maybe one day they'll get around to all the other bug reports for the HSTVL's gun, but one can only hope. The next change that's actually really noticeable is the XM800T went from a 13 km/h or so reverse gear all the way up to a 43 km/h reverse gear, so the very trolly vehicle just got even more trolly and even more fun, and this should be a really great upgrade for an otherwise really great and fun vehicle. The first new vehicle is the T1E1 90mm for USA, and this is essentially the T1E1 but with a 90mm instead of the old 3-inch gun. On the whole, I think this is a really good vehicle. The fact that it's at 5.7 kind of surprised surprised me because the M4 T26 is at 6.0 for some god-awful reason. So this is actually at a pretty reasonable battle rating, and the USA 5.7 lineup really needs more 90mm given how often it sees up tiers. So this is pretty nice, especially in conjunction with the last 2 changes. Next up, Germany, who's getting the Puma IFV, this time with spike missiles. The spike missiles increase its battle rating to 10.7, which is pretty fair. It's very similar to the Namur 30 that's at 10.3, except the Puma is both faster but has a little less armor. On the whole, this should still be a pretty capable vehicle. Next up, we have the ZSU 23-4. This is the Afghansi model, as it's called, for the Afghanistan war, where obviously there weren't a lot of aircraft, so they removed the radar and just used it against ground targets. This should be pretty good as a 7.3 anti-air because the guns have a high rate of fire and a good spread, so they're pretty easy to aim. On the whole, I'm not really sure the Soviets needed this addition to their tech tree, but it should be pretty useful nonetheless, especially as the ZSU 57-2 before it is more of a light tank than an anti-air. For the UK, they're getting the Stormer AD, which is basically a LAVAD, except it doesn't have the mobility of a LAVAD and it doesn't have the FFAR rockets, and at that point it's just not a LAVAD, so it's a LAVAD with fundamental differences. I'm not really sure it necessarily belongs at 10.0 because the big strength of the LAVAD was its ability to drive around hammering things with rockets, but we'll wait and see. It's not bad, I'm just not sure if it's going to be as good of its American cousin. Next up, we have a Japanese squadron vehicle, the CTWV RCV. This is essentially a Type 16 chassis, but instead it has a 30mm Bushmaster cannon on top. It should be a pretty decent and fun vehicle, and it is kind of unique within the Japanese tech tree, as currently their only wheeled autocannon vehicle is the Type 80, which is a lot lower in battle rating and not stabilized. On the whole, as a squadron vehicle, it is fun and unique, so it should be worth getting, at least to round out some lineups. Next up, we have China, who's getting Truck-kun, aka Antelope, who's here to isekai some planes out of the sky. Now, this thing is basically an improved Chaparral, but with much better mobility. I'm not sure this is going to be dramatically better than the PGZ-04, but we'll have to wait and see. On the whole, I don't think it's bad. I'm just not sure if it's necessarily going to be better than the other existing options. For France, you're getting the Dutch CV9035 as a squadron vehicle, and this Dutch CV9035 actually trades some of its mobility for armor, which is not exactly a great trade given how little armor it has. On the whole, I'm not super excited by this, especially as the VBC and the Vectra are both at 9.7 and are both light vehicles, and the VBC seems almost entirely better as it's faster and has an unmanned turret, but we'll wait and see. This is kind of last on my list of squadron vehicles released this patch to research. I don't think it's going to be all that great. And lastly, for ground vehicles, we have the Tehran 6 for Israel, which is a T-62 with a bunch of machine guns bolted to it and a 50 cal over the barrel, and honestly, this is just probably going to be a great tank. The T-62 is a pretty good and versatile tank. In fact, I was playing it pretty recently and lamented to my friend that didn't have any roof-mounted machine guns, and Israel has helpfully solved that problem with not one but 2 of them. So this should be pretty good in the already excellent Israel 8.7 lineup. And that wraps up everything I'm going to cover for this video. There are a lot of other minor changes, both to vehicle characteristics, maps, other stuff like that I'm not really going to cover. This is just supposed to be a quick and dirty what to expect from the update. On the whole, while it's a small update, I do kind of like it. There's a decent number of unique vehicles that fill stuff out, and some nice quality of life features like the sights and other stuff. So on the whole, I would say this is a pretty decent like A-tier update in my opinion, but of course let me know down in the comments down below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What vehicle are you looking forward to getting to the most? I do of course always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.